Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition. It is the first day of July. July 1, 2014. It is a pleasure to be with you. As I announced yesterday, on Tuesdays we're going to be beginning half an hour late, so it's half past the hour of 1 in the East now, and I welcome you to the Virtual Center. I hope that the delay of a half an hour didn't mess too many people up, but we will still end our program at the regular time at 3 p.m. in the East. So on Tuesdays, our program will run for an hour and a half rather than 2 hours. And again, it's primarily because of my membership in the Rotary Club here, and the Rotary Club meets at noon on Tuesdays. So and runs till with the program, the meeting doesn't end until 1, so there's no way that I could be back here to begin our program at 1. So the best we can do is 1:30, and I was telling Bob Kincaid that I literally just walked in the door like 3 minutes ago, so it's going to take me a while to get my head together. Also, I found out at the meeting today that I lost a good friend overnight, one of my dearest friends who we've been good friends here in southern West Virginia since the early 70s. I can remember meeting him in 1973 for the first time, and we've remained fast friends. And I knew he was having health problems. I didn't have any idea that they were this serious. But anyway, we will survive. And I know my friend Dan would want the program to go on, so to speak, so it will go on. And welcome to the program today. Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to welcome you again to our program. I invite you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call. I know you know as well that yesterday there were a couple of very significant Supreme Court cases which I really believe in a not too distant program we're going to have to address in a lot more detail. But the court ended its session on June 30th with the Hobby Lobby decision, so-called, in another one of those contentious 5-4 decisions, which raised serious questions. In fact, the political debate right now is whether, in fact, the 5-4 decision yesterday was a victory for conservatives or whether it'll turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory. By that I mean that they may have won the battle, but they might lose the war. That the implications, at least so far, are that the actions of the Supreme Court majority in recent decisions, going back to Citizens United, the McCutcheon decision, and now these two decisions yesterday, might just so inflame the electorate that the turnout for the fall elections might be much greater than it would have been without those decisions. And if that's true, then in effect, this could turn out to be what seems to be a victory could turn out to be a defeat in disguise. But we will see, and we will pursue those issues in detail in a later program. I invite you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate privately one-on-one with me directly on some of the issues that we're raising here at the Virtual Center, by all means, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, and O'Brien is I-E-N, not I-A-N, 906@gmail.com. Yesterday, in our first program this week, we introduced Garry Wills' book, Inventing America, and committed to a few programs, probably at least today and probably tomorrow as well, on looking at the significance of this program. And if I can, I'd like to perhaps take a moment and just kind of review where we were yesterday so that we can pursue this investigation here at the Virtual Center today. At the end of the program yesterday, Bob Kincaid was kind enough to get on the line for the last 10 minutes of our time together, and he made what I think are some very, very poignant, very observant comments that I think are worth repeating. And those are to suggest the spiritual or religious overtones, if you will, to much of the political debate that's going on in our contemporary world between, so-called, between the right and the left, or between liberals and conservatives, between Democrats and Republicans, however you want to phrase or frame the discussion and the debate. There's absolutely no question that in the mind of many, partisanship in today's society has become so extreme that it's making negotiation and moving forward in a positive, united way more and more difficult. It is ironic that on the same day that we closed the program talking about the religious overtones of the controversy over the founders and the debate over the founders as it focused on the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, that we would close the program on a religious note, knowing that at approximately the same time, on the same day, the Supreme Court was reaching one of its more momentous decisions in the so-called Hobby Lobby case, where the court awarded to closely held corporations family businesses, if you were, even though they grew into major corporations like Hobby Lobby. But what the court essentially approved yesterday by a 5-4 majority was the right of the religious, First Amendment religious convictions of the owners to affect the kind of health care coverage that is given to employees. And depending on which side of the fence you're on, you could say that this was a blow for religious freedom, or you could say it was a blow against employees, or to put it another way, it was a victory for the religious beliefs of the corporate owners, but it was a defeat potentially for the religious beliefs and convictions of the employees of that same company. But in the course of rendering the majority decision, Justice Alito reiterated the issue that we've been focusing on here at the Virtual Center for some time, which is the extent to which corporations under the 14th Amendment are to be interpreted and viewed as persons. And there's no question that that particular practice received a boost in yesterday's decision. Because now not only are corporations entitled to First Amendment rights related to speech and press, but now religion as well. So I think there's a lot here. And of course the other decision yesterday struck down mandatory union dues for a particular class of public employees. It's unclear at this point how many people that's going to directly harm, but it's yet one more nail in the coffin being prepared for organized labor in America. And I think that also is an issue that we need to pursue here in a future program at the Virtual Center. But what we were talking about yesterday at the end of our program specifically was the role that Abraham Lincoln played in launching the view of the Declaration of Independence, which has shifted the emphasis from the grievances listed in the Declaration, the grievances leveled at England as a way to justify the right to colonial independence, which was the major focus of the Declaration as written by Jefferson and as passed by Congress in 1776. But beginning with Lincoln and his view of the Declaration and his emphasis on Jefferson's statements about equality, which are obviously tied up in the issue of the abolition of slavery associated with the end of the Civil War, then in his efforts to argue for the rights to equality of ex-slaves, Lincoln launched a symbolic interpretation of the Declaration, excuse me, the preamble to the Declaration, which has grown to the point that that preamble has been, in effect, become the focus of attention on the Declaration itself, to the detriment, obviously, of the specific grievances listed against the king. In other words, the whole focus, the whole emphasis on what the Declaration of Independence was all about, what it was intended to be about, what it was supposed to accomplish, has shifted. And I think we can locate the source of that shift in the speeches and arguments of Abraham Lincoln during and after, in the mid-19th century. And in our conversation with Bob Kincaid yesterday, we were talking about the religious overtones of that and suggesting, Bob was suggesting, that, the religious right, since it has difficulty trying to find language uttered by Christ himself related to issues like gay marriage and homosexuality specifically, that the right is very, very comfortable in going to St. Paul for language on that particular issue. So also, conservatives today are very comfortable in suggesting that Lincoln's interpretation of the focus of the Declaration of Independence is in reality Jefferson's emphasis and focus in the Declaration of Independence. I would suggest, I tried to suggest yesterday, that is a leap that one finds very, very difficult to support. In a sense, what is happening is that the political agenda of some is being supported by taking, in this case, the Declaration of Independence, out of its historical context, out of the hands of the person who drafted it and the Congress that approved it, and giving it a meaning which supports a particular political agenda in today's world, even though such a move is historically inaccurate. And I think that's a very, very good point that Bob made. And I think I made the point, and I've seen references to this as well, that in the span of events in American history, one could argue, in fact, people do argue, that the Declaration of Independence with Lincoln and the Civil War received a needed shot in the arm, if you will. That Lincoln began to find meaning and assign meaning to the Declaration that really wasn't attributable at all to its author. And so, in a sense, one could say that the Declaration of Independence, in the historical flow of events, could kind of be seen as a resurrection, if you will, in the significance and symbolic meaning of the Declaration of Independence, the basis on which America's unique role in the world, America's mission to reform the world, and all of the other factors associated with the idea that the United States of America is a very special place created for a very special reason came into being. So much of what the right argues, the Christian right argues today about the founding, finds its origins right here. And my point in yesterday's introductory program on Garry Wills' study of the Declaration, Inventing America, my point was that part of that campaign, part of that political campaign, is the need to stifle and suppress alternative views of the Declaration of Independence which are not consistent with this new chosen strategy of utilizing the Declaration of Independence to support a particular political agenda. Because associated with the elevation of the Declaration of Independence to a level, a philosophical and moral level, that really wasn't there when it was drafted. Part of that strategy, part of that campaign, involves necessarily the reduction of the Constitution of the United States in its overall importance and significance. To put this in another way, if the Declaration of Independence is to be seen as a spiritual document, then by definition that means it must be given precedence, must be given priority over the Constitution. So consequently, as the Declaration is elevated in significance and importance, so also must the overall significance of the Constitution be reduced proportionally. And indeed that has happened. So what we see with Lincoln's behavior and activities during the Civil War, this is not a criticism of Lincoln at all, because Lincoln is utilizing the Declaration and utilizing the heritage of the nation in order to make some very specific points about holding the Union together and bringing the Union back together after the Civil War. So nothing in what I'm saying is intended to belittle or demean that effort on the part of President Lincoln at all. What I'm suggesting is that there are people who have attached their political wagons, if you will, to Lincoln, to the point that they try to insist that Lincoln should be considered one of the founders because of the new life that he has breathed into the Declaration of Independence. And my point was that part of that campaign, part of that effort, is to bury or suppress interpretive views of the Declaration which would raise serious historical questions about the legitimacy of the campaign itself. In other words, if you give credibility to Garry Wills and his effort to link Jefferson and link Jefferson's Declaration to a totally different philosophical school of thought, which is, for lack of a better term, the Scottish Enlightenment, then in doing that, what Garry Wills does is raise serious questions about so many aspects of the Declaration of Independence and its meaning, especially the meaning of its preamble, that it raises serious doubts about the efforts of the right to use the Declaration of Independence for its own contemporary political purposes. So consequently, there's no question that the attacks on the credibility and the scholarship of Garry Wills have been intense. My point, and this is the conclusion of my review of yesterday's program, The point that I would like to leave you with on this score is that we do not necessarily have to prove that Garry Wills' interpretation of Jefferson is the correct one. And those who argue that the Declaration is based principally on the writings and philosophy of John Locke is the wrong one, we don't have to prove that. All we have to do, it seems to me, is raise enough doubts about the orthodoxy of the Carl Becker approach. Carl Becker, in his study of the Declaration of Independence, published in 1922, is the origin of the firm statement that the Declaration of Independence takes its philosophy directly from John Locke. I don't think we have to demean one school of thought in order to introduce the prospects of stability and relevancy in another. Rather, what we are doing, and this is really what the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility is about, is to raise questions and open up investigation and raise possibilities and look at alternative ways of looking at things that have pretty much been looked at the same way for so long that the book, so-called, has been closed on those particular issues. Again, I mentioned yesterday the television series Matlock. And in defending his clients, Matlock doesn't necessarily have to find the guilty party in order to secure the release of his clients. All he has to do is supply enough evidence to raise reasonable doubt that his client is the criminal. What it does is open up the issue again and make it more likely that the real criminal will eventually be found and prosecuted. It seems to me that what we're doing here at the Virtual Center is introducing Garry Wills and introducing his philosophy and introducing his look at the Declaration of Independence and the philosophical origins and potential meanings of the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, and leaving it up to investigators to continue to pursue evidence in order to arrive at something closer to the truth. In essence, does Garry Wills' scholarship at least call into question the absolutism and orthodoxy associated with the argument or the theory that Jefferson took his Declaration of Independence, his preamble, his philosophy, directly from the writings of John Locke? If we can prove that, if we can prove that there's reasonable doubt, that's as far as we have a right to go in terms of honesty and fairness here at the Virtual Center. I do not want, and I don't think you do either, do not want the Virtual Center to become a platform for asserting and screaming a particular interpretation of the past. The goal of the Virtual Center is to enhance and build understanding and appreciation for the founders and for the work that the founders did, that completed, not to argue for a particular interpretation of one or the other of the founders or the particular issue that they were involved in. But I do believe that the hostility associated with the challenges to Garry Wills says something about how poignant and how significant what Garry Wills has done or tried to do is in the historical flow of events, so to speak. I think Garry Wills has done a masterful job. I think, and again, I will say this, I made what I thought were positive comments yesterday. I'd like to continue them today. I believe that Garry Wills' scholarship is creditable. I believe he deserves credit for what he has tried to do. He literally has tried to get into the head of Thomas Jefferson in order to look at the world the way he believes Jefferson probably looked at it, in order to try to understand exactly what Jefferson meant and what Jefferson thought he meant when he began to put pen to paper and draft the preamble to the Declaration of the Declaration of Independence. A historical fact that I probably should have mentioned yesterday, but I neglected to. In 1970, 45 years ago, there was a horrendous fire at Monticello, and much of Jefferson's work, many of his papers, and many of the books that he valued in his library were destroyed. I've seen references to the fact that there are probably only 10 or a dozen letters and papers written by Jefferson before, in the early years that survived prior to the Declaration. Much of the information that we get about Jefferson, we glean from his only publication, which was his Notes on the State of Virginia, which were published in 1782, which was 6 years after the Declaration of Independence. So we have the Declaration, and we have a number of documents that Jefferson either wrote or participated with others in writing in the 1770s, leading up to the Declaration of Independence, and a few letters to that period. But effectively, we don't have a whole lot to go on what Jefferson believed about anything prior to the 1770s, prior to the movement toward independence. Jefferson, the student at William and Mary for 4 years, no longer exists. All of those records, all of his journals, all of his papers, everything is gone. We can look at many of the books that Jefferson tried to replace in his library as an indication of the books and points of view he seemed to value most. This is the kind of investigative journalism that Garry Wills has undertaken. I think he's done a spectacular job. And I trust in our second hour today, and we are right at the top of the first hour now, in our second hour today, what I would hope to do is to try to recreate, with due credit to Garry Wills, to try to recreate what he seeks to create, which is a way to get into the head of Thomas Jefferson, trying to find the key that allows us to look at the world the way it appears Jefferson looked at the world. Jefferson, as we know, was one of the most creative, inventive, perceptive, hard to pin down of the founders. Many people refer to him as the classic Renaissance man. He was into everything. He was a scientist. He was an environmentalist. He was a journalist. He was a farmer. He was a horticulturalist. He was a philosopher. He was a politician. Jefferson was involved in so much at the same time that he's one of the more difficult people to nail down. In reality, what orthodox interpretations of American history have done is try to nail down Thomas Jefferson by eliminating all the other possibilities except the interpretation that seems to fit into the world some of us want to create today. In essence, we are literally cherry-picking the mind of Thomas Jefferson. We are choosing which things to emphasize and which things to totally ignore or suppress. I think Garry Wills has done noble service to the history and the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, because he has allowed us to see aspects of Jefferson that many of us never knew were there. What I would like to do in our second hour today is share that perspective with those of you here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is 1 minute after the hour of 2 in the East. Let's pause. We won't take a little 5-minute break. Let's pause for just a minute or two while I kind of get my head together and my notes together. And then we'll look at in our second hour and try to get a handle on the world as Thomas Jefferson would explain it. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center. We'll be back in a minute or two. Thank you for listening, and please stay with us. Thank you all very, very much for your presence here at the Virtual Center on this Tuesday, the first day of July in the year 2014. This is the beginning of our second hour in today's program, and I welcome you. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us for the first half hour of our program on this Tuesday, I thank you for being with us and staying with us. And again, I invite you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call and giving our listeners an opportunity to hear your ideas on some of these issues and some of these events. I am particularly interested, and I'm going to say this going into this hour, I am particularly interested in your reaction to what I hope I will be successful in doing today, which is giving all of us a glimpse into the worldview, into the mind, if you will, of Thomas Jefferson, because I think it's intriguing and it's informative and it's exciting, and it raises some serious questions about an issue which I believe is very important, the Declaration of Independence, an issue on which there have been too few questions raised for far too long. So to question the unquestioned, I believe, is a major service which makes an operation like the Virtual Center worth having and sustaining. I hope you will agree. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. It'll get you directly on the air. That's 304-574-8178. You will be calling into our studios. You will probably get Bob Kincaid on the other line, and Bob will get you on the air as quickly as possible. Again, that's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate with me directly one-on-one via email, I'd love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get into the program, if I can just make a personal comment, I mentioned when we came on the air a half hour ago at half past the hour that I had learned at lunch today that I had lost a very good friend, a friend for half a century. Last evening, I did not know that my friend Dan had passed away, and Bob even asked if I was okay to go with the program today, and I said I was. I don't know whether I really was or not. But let me tell you, there is something about the material that we're dealing with. There is something about the founding. There's something about appreciating and trying to get your arms around a brilliant mind that makes it possible for me to put my loss, my personal loss, on hold, at least for the purposes of our program. I had hoped, as I was driving home to do the program today, I had hoped that that focus on the material itself would make it possible for me to do a program. And it has done that. And I just want you to know that, because I think it doesn't speak anything about me. It says an awful lot about the founders and about what they accomplished. I think it just, again, is yet one more reason why I believe that that what these people have left us is so well worth our time to try to understand and appreciate more fully. And that's what we're all about. So with that, let me begin the program, and I'm going to actually begin with an issue or a couple of issues that aren't related directly to the worldview of Thomas Jefferson, but they are important historical parts of the story of the origins of the Declaration of Independence. And specifically, they are the successful movements to the point that the Declaration of Independence is even drafted and finally adopted. This goes into a little bit of the background of the First and Second Continental Congresses. And you may remember from your history books that the First Continental Congress met in September of 1774, and then it adjourned to reconvene in the spring of 1775, in May of 1775. So what the history books refer to as the Second Continental Congress opened in Philadelphia in May of 1775. And it's that Congress that begins to debate and ultimately approves the creation of the drafting committee, of which Thomas Jefferson ends up to be the key figure, because he's assigned the job of drafting a Declaration of Independence in the spring and late spring and early summer of 1776. In Garry Wills' book, he includes a number of chapters to tell this story, which has been told many times by many different people. In order to give credit where credit is due, let me share with you the insights that one can gain by reading about especially the role of Sam Adams in Massachusetts and Boston politics prior to the calling of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. What Wills has been able to do is give us some insight into the incredibly significant role that Sam Adams played in pulling off and building this movement to the point that a Declaration of Independence is even possible. There's a brilliant section in one of his early chapters. In the first part, let me suggest, first of all, let me give you a little bit of the organization of the book. Wills's book is divided into 5 parts. And in each part, there are anywhere from 4 to 6 to 7 chapters. The first part, part 1, is on the Declaration of Independence as revolutionary charter. In other words, as the culmination of a historical story that begins with the protests against Great Britain, goes through the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, and ends with the calling of the First Continental Congress, the convening of the Second Continental Congress in the spring of 1775, and its ultimate decision to endorse Richard Henry Lee's motion of June 6th, 1776, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. In one of his chapters, early chapters, Wills does a brilliant job with Sam Adams. I just want to give you an idea. He has an extensive quote here from John Adams, the writings of John Adams. And John explains, John is Sam's cousin, and John is in this letter, John is explaining his introduction to this revolutionary movement. He's an attorney. Attorneys don't usually participate in revolutions. John Adams, at this point, is 34 years old, and he writes a series of letters in which he's talking about how his cousin Sam helped to manipulate an open debate which ultimately produces the independence movement in America. This is a quote from one of those letters. John says, "This day I learned that the Caucus Club meets at certain times in the garret, G-A-R-R-E-T, in the garret of Thomas Dawes, the adjutant of the Boston Regiment, the Boston Militia. He has a large house, and he has a movable petition in his garret, which he takes down, and the whole club can meet in one room. There they smoke tobacco till you cannot see from one end of the garret to the other. There they drink flip, I suppose, and there they choose a moderator who puts questions to the vote regularly, and selectmen, assessors, collectors, wardens, fire wards, and representatives are regularly chosen before they are chosen in the town." In other words, John Adams has been allowed by his cousin Sam to get in on the planning, the internal planning, which produces American independence in Boston politics. It's a fascinating, fascinating look. And the point is, it's 7 years after John Adams gets his first glimpse into the smoke-filled room that John becomes a full partner in the operation which becomes this revolutionary movement. Sam Adams is very, very careful who he admits into the inner circle. And Garry Wills makes the point that most of Sam Adams's papers and writings have been destroyed. Not by other people. He destroyed a lot of them. He didn't want written records of a lot of this. I think this is a fascinating story. This is a story that would get our school children really excited about the revolution, really excited about the founders. Going back to the sources, I think it's fascinating. As part of the story, Garry Wills talks about the challenge to British management of her colonies. What is necessary on the part of the colonies to build the kind of union, not only within the colonies themselves, within each colony, but among the colonies, to build a movement, and the efforts of the British to thwart those revolutionary strategies. The strategy of Great Britain. And for his source, Garry Wills goes to the writings of Thomas Pownall. Thomas Pownall, P-O-W-N-A-L-L, was governor of Massachusetts prior to the movement towards independence. He actually was considered to be one of the more popular and one of the more enlightened governors of Massachusetts. He returns to England, and he is giving advice to London on what's going on in America and what England must do in order to thwart a movement which he sees as leading to the potential of independence. Here's a brilliant piece from the writings of Thomas Pownall. What he's talking about here is that one way to prevent unity among the different colonies is to stress and strengthen the dependence of each colony on the mother country. In other words, don't allow the colonies to become dependent on each other. Require them to be more and more dependent on the mother country as individual separate items. If you keep their focus on their relations with the mother country rather than on each other, then you go a long way towards thwarting any kind of a revolutionary movement. And that's what this passage is about. This is from Thomas Pownall. Great Britain, he says, must be the center of attraction to which these colonies, in the administration of every power of their government, in the exercise of their judicial powers, in the execution of their laws, and in every operation of their trade, must tend. Great Britain, he says, must be the center of attraction for every colony in the administration and the way they operate their government, in the way their judicial powers work, in the way the laws are executed, in the operation of all their trade, their commerce. All of this must be focused principally on the mother country rather than on their fellow colonies. They will remain under the constant influence of the attraction of this center and cannot move but that every direction of such movement will converge to the same. In other words, the more dependent and the more in constant communication they are with the mother country, the less likely it is that they will build alliances and dependencies in other directions. And as it is not more necessary to preserve the several governments subordinate in their respective orbs than it is essential to the preservation of the whole empire to keep them disconnected and independent of each other, they must be guarded by this union against having or forming any principle of coherence with each other, above that whereby they cohere to this center, this first mover. In other words, England's strategy in order to be successful must be to keep the colonies from joining together. And the way to do that is to build greater and stronger and more frequent communication between each colony and the mother country. Make England the center of their universe, not the fact that they are one amongst a number of other colonies. Divide and conquer. Do not allow them to unify, is Pownall's advice to London. They should always remain incapable of any coherence or of so conspiring amongst themselves as to create any other equal force which might recoil back on this first mover. The first mover is the mother country. So in a sense, what Pownall is telling us here is that the mother country has a strategy. The mother country is devising a way to manage the colonies in order to keep them colonies, keep them dependent on the empire, keep them within the empire, and the way to do that is to build their dependency on the mother country in as many different ways and as exclusively as you possibly can. This was the British strategy. This was the way that Great Britain decided best to manage an empire of colonies located thousands of miles away from the mother country. Here's a model for modern corporations that have become international. How do you manage a huge growing organization or corporation with officers and branches all over the country, all over the world? How do you manage a university or a college that has campuses in other countries? How do you manage a large, spread out situation where all of those you must manage are not physically right there? England has come up with a strategy. Think back to your studies in school of American independence. Weren't we always told that the mother country really didn't have a strategy? That the mother country just kind of blundered into independence for the colonies? That England didn't know what was doing? That George III was incompetent and mentally challenged and all of these other things? And that England didn't have a strategy? The fact of the matter is England did have a strategy. It may not have worked. But if it didn't work, that's to the credit of Sam Adams, because that's what Sam Adams had to confront and challenge successfully, and he was able to do it. And the story that Garry Wills tells us of Adams and the two Adamses, once John becomes a member of the group, especially at the first Congress, and how the New Englanders, Sam and John Adams and John Hancock and the others, are able to manipulate the delegates from the other colonies, especially Virginia, because Virginia is the largest and most prestigious of the 13 colonies. It's also the wealthiest because of tobacco. And they know, Sam Adams and John both know, that if independence is going to have a chance, Virginia has to be a part of it. Virginia is a key player in whether this can work. And if Virginia is a key player, then you bet your bottom dollar George Washington has to be a key player. We have got to get him in this. So they consciously devise a strategy to bring the delegates, the leaders of Virginia, into the movement. And Virginians become critical operators through the Congress in what becomes the Declaration of Independence. It's a brilliant strategy. Sam Adams is operating behind the scenes. He speaks very little. He meets at night. He meets in the taverns. He visits people, delegates, on their own time when they are not in session. And he basically sells his agenda then, there, and in that way. It is absolutely brilliant. There is no way that a teacher in any public school at any level couldn't teach this stuff in a way which would absolutely enthrall kids. It's absolutely fascinating. Wills tells that story. It's a hell of a story. And I think all of us would be well put to and could appreciate it. In one of the studies of this period, James Henderson talks about the 1760s and the building of the opposition movement to the mother country during the 1760s, and the extent to which, if London is to be the center of the universe as far as the colonies are concerned, then one must logically conclude that the seeds of independence are sown there in London, not in America. If the colony's main contact is with England, then one must look there for the beginnings of the independence movement of the colonies. Let me read you a passage from James Henderson's study. Actually, he says, if a center of communication existed for the proponents of radical existence at the end of the decade, it could be found not in New York, where the Stamp Act Congress was held, but in London, where policy was made and colonial protests were directed, where colonial agents were located and a community of Americans from the whole continent resided. If each colony was going to be dependent on the mother country, then the colonial agent to England became a key player. And in London, what you end up with is communication between the agents of the different colonies with each other. So the irony of the situation, England's policy strategy backfires, not because the colonies begin to communicate with each other, but their agents in England begin to communicate with each other. And from there begins the movement, which then goes back to the colonies, and that's the role that Sam Adams plays. You may remember that one of the key colonial agents in England during this period is Benjamin Franklin. And the career of Benjamin Franklin in getting to know and getting to work with the agents and the representatives of the other colonies is what makes the First Continental Congress even possible. Henderson goes on. It was London where policy was made and colonial protests directed, where colonial agents were located and a community of Americans from the whole continent resided, and where a controversy over constitutional liberties within England already raged. Many of the arguments that the colonists were going to use against England were already being raised in England. And that's where these people became familiar with them. In this sense, Henderson says, London supplies what was lacking in the colonies, a location where opposition to innovations in British policy could be given continuous expression by Americans and colonial agents, where intercolonial contacts could be established and sustained both directly and indirectly. We are beginning to see how the American Revolution happened. Wills is telling one hell of a story. I think it's one that all of us have some obligation, at least, to become familiar with. In the 1760s, Thomas Pownall basically suggests that if the colonies are able to come together and move towards something like independence, it is principally because the mother country was stupid. Because England, he argued, had everything going for it to make this kind of unity impossible. In other words, it seems to me, in a backhanded way, what Pownall is doing is praising the accomplishments of Sam and John Adams in their ability to build this movement against these kind of odds. This is another quote from Thomas Pownall that I think you'll find quite interesting. No one colony, he says, can by itself become independent, and no two, under the present state of their constitutions, have any possible communication of power or interest that can unite them in such a measure. They have not the means of forming they have not the means of forming such. They have neither legislative nor executive powers that are extended to more than one. The laws of one extend not to the other. They have no common magistracy, no common ground. In short, no one principle of association amongst them. On the contrary, as I have said elsewhere, the different manner in which they are settled, the different modes under which they live, the different forms of charters, grants, and frames of government which they possess, the various principles of repulsion that these create, the different interests which they actuate, the religious interests by which they are actuated, the rivalship and jealousies which arise from hence, and the impracticability, if not impossibility, of reconciling and accommodating these incomparable ideas and claims will keep the several provinces and colonies perpetually independent of and unconnected with each other and dependent on the mother country. How wrong Pownall was. There was so much working against the possibility of uniting the colonies into common cause that one must appreciate the efforts of the revolutionaries, of the Sam and John Adamses and the Dr. Warrens and John Hancocks and the others who were able to pull this off. And when they were able to incorporate and bring Richard Henry Lee and young Jefferson and many of these other people, prominent Virginians and Marylanders and Pennsylvanians, into the fold, they are able to build a movement which conservatives in the Continental Congresses find very, very difficult to stop. It's brilliant. I think it's a story that all of us need to appreciate and know about. Back to the Declaration of Independence. We've just gone beyond the bottom of our second hour, so we've got about 25 minutes left in our program. So let me begin. I mentioned that this would probably be more than today, and clearly it's going to be. Garry Wills does a very, very creditable job, it seems to me, in laying out the framework, the organization, and the structure of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And needless to say, in this first portion of his book, Part 1, where he's looking at the Declaration as a revolutionary charter, as a statement of reasons why the revolution had to happen, he focuses principally on the principal focus of the Declaration, which is on the grievances leveled against the mother country. Jefferson opens the Declaration of Independence by saying, whenever it becomes necessary, we'll get to the word necessary in a moment, whenever it becomes necessary to go before the world and explain a movement this significant, then one, by definition, one must lay out the causes. And consequently, that's what Jefferson sets out to do, is explain and justify to the nation and the world, to America's own people, as well as to the peoples of the world, the fact that the colonies really had no choice. He makes such a strong case against the mother country that he almost leaves one asking, if these kinds of things were happening to you, wouldn't you have done the same thing that we did, that we found we had to do? It's that solid a case. What Jefferson does is lay out a string of grievances, charges against the king. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will find a whole list of specific allegations against the king. All of them, there are 12. Beginning with, he has. He has done this, he has done that, he has not done this, he has violated the Constitution by doing that. In other words, he lays out a whole, in the very first portion of he divides the grievances into 4 parts effectively. The first list of grievances begin with the introduction, he has, listing essentially the kinds of things that the king has done. Quickly, these are the 12. He has disallowed laws. He has suspended our laws. He has extended representation by requiring us to accept representation for people we didn't elect. He has moved assemblies. He has moved the location of where our elected representatives meet, in a lot of cases to make the attendance at these meetings inconvenient. He has not only moved our assemblies, he has dissolved our assemblies. He has canceled elections. He has raised questions about naturalization of our citizens. He has caused our courts not to be held. He has directly interceded and involved himself in the way we pay our judges, in judicial salaries. He has hired excise officers, tax collectors, to tax our trade, tax our business. He has inflicted standing armies upon us. He has questioned the idea of civil supremacy, the right of the people to control the military. He has done all of these things. 12 specific charges or allegations against the king. Then he goes to a second list of grievances, and in this he shifts from he has. Now he lists 9 things which begin, he has combined with others. In other words, he has joined Parliament to do the following. He has united with others in order to do the following things to us. Among those are quartering troops in private homes, subjecting our citizens to military trials, forbidden business, forbidden trade in certain places with certain people, impose taxes without our elected representatives' consent, interfered with the right of our citizens to jury trial. He has moved trials into convenient to inconvenient places in order to avoid local juries, in order to deny people the right to be tried by a jury of their peers. He's moved the trials many times to England in order to get a guilty verdict. He, along with Parliament, is responsible for the Quebec Act, which legitimizes Catholicism in the New World. He has actually dissolved our charters that we hold from the king, and he has dissolved our assemblies. So on top of the 12 things that he did specifically, he has joined with Parliament to do these other 9 things to us. Then, in the third part of the list of grievances, he addresses 4 or 5 things that have happened most recently, just prior to the Declaration, which involve aggression, which involve the hiring of mercenaries, troops, Hessian troops, if you remember. He has used prisoners against us. He has opened our prisons, let out prisoners, and armed them against us. And he has used the Indians against us. And the last part of the grievances is that the king has refused to redress any of these grievances which we have pointed out to him and petitioned him to do something about over and over again. Conclusion, we have no choice. We have tried everything. As Patrick Henry said at St. John's Church, we have begged, we have petitioned, we have prostrated ourselves. We have done everything. We have extended olive branches. We have done everything to try to avoid the act which we must now take, which is to leave the empire. Obviously, the case that Jefferson has made is so strong that, in effect, he has suggested that it's England that is responsible for this, not us. England has violated the charter. England has overstepped the bounds of legitimate government. England has done what we all know justifies the right of the people to abolish government and to set up a new government that will abide by the terms of the social contract. And that is the Declaration of Independence. The only major omission, major change, is the last item that Jefferson put in his draft, his initial draft of the Declaration, which is an extensive criticism of the slave trade. And he basically suggests that the mother country and the king's efforts to help British merchants and tobacco creditors is the justification for the slave trade. In other words, we're not the ones that started the slave trade. England imposed the slave trade upon us. England's the one that was responsible for the slave ships that came here loaded down with slaves who were brought here against their will for economic purposes. And what he did was submit these colonies to an influx of all these people that didn't want to be here, that didn't come here of their own will. Now we got to figure out how to live with it. And so, in a sense, Jefferson is trying to lay the blame for slavery and the slave trade on the mother country as well. The Southern delegates insist that that whole issue be struck, or they will not support the Declaration. And so Jefferson is forced to remove Instead, Congress inserts in the Declaration a charge, quote, "He has excited domestic insurrection among us." That's the replacement for the whole issue of slavery. That's Jefferson's case. I think Wills does a credible job, a very creditable job, sharing that with us. Thus, the Declaration of Independence is drafted and solved. And we have the conclusion of what Garry Wills entitles a revolutionary charter. This is the story of the Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary charter, a document designed to justify the right of colonial independence. The second part of Wills' book looks at the Declaration of Independence as a scientific paper. And this is where we begin to gain some insight into the worldview, into the head, if you will, of Thomas Jefferson. If you begin to look at the Declaration of Independence from the perspective of the world as Jefferson understood it, we all know that Jefferson fashioned himself as a scientist. And what we need to appreciate, and this is me talking, and I'm going to do my best here because this is a little bit abstract. The world that the founders knew, the world that the founders understood in the 18th century, is the world explained as well as nobody else could explain it by Isaac Newton and his laws that governed the universe. What Isaac Newton was able to do was explain the unexplainable. Newton was able to find laws that governed the universe. He was able to use math and science in order to prove and explain the universe as it functioned. And one of the things he was able to bring to people was an appreciation for the fact that the universe was based and built upon order. The universe was not the product of happenstance. The universe was not random. It was not an accident that the planets and stars didn't crash into each other. Rather, what Newton was able to show and prove was that there were laws governing the universe. There was a natural order of things. Nature had order. Nature had system. There was a pattern to things like the seasons, the transition from spring to summer to fall to winter. There was a pattern, a regular pattern, which was predictable. What Newton was able to do was to convince mankind that the medieval view of the world, which was that the only person that understood how the universe functioned was God, because God originally created it, and that the human mind was incapable of understanding the mind of God. What Newton had found instead was that there were real laws, so-called natural laws. The most famous one we know is gravity, the laws of gravity, the laws of attraction, magnetism. What Newton was able to bring to the world was an appreciation not only that there was order in the universe, but that man was capable of understanding what that order was about, how it worked. Man could know. Man could study. Man could learn and understand. Man could predict. And at least in theory, man could ultimately, possibly, affect change or control. In a nutshell, this is really what the Enlightenment is all about. The reason that we use the term enlightenment is because, obviously, the world is enlightened with the discovery of these laws of the universe. The laws of science enable one to understand and appreciate mysteries that prior to this time nobody could understand or nobody even thought they might understand. This was not only the world of Isaac Newton. This became the world of Thomas Jefferson. This is the world that fascinated Jefferson. Jefferson was fascinated by the way the universe worked. He was fascinated by the universe. He was fascinated by the laws of nature. And he was captivated with people who seemed to understand it. One of the people that was considered by Jefferson to be one of the most brilliant minds that he had ever encountered is a scientist from Philadelphia named David Rittenhouse. David Rittenhouse was a representative at the Continental Congresses from Pennsylvania. He was also a scientist. He understood Newton. He understood the universe. He was an inventor. At one point in his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson identified him amongst three people that he believed that were the most brilliant people in America, geniuses: Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and David Rittenhouse. Most of us have never even heard of David Rittenhouse. What a disgrace. If you happen to see the play 1776, the musical, if you haven't, you need to find it, rent it. You can get it on, you can get it for practically nothing. The DVD. It is absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that makes it worth viewing is not only because it's wonderful entertainment, but it's one of the most historically accurate portraits of the founders that exists. Throughout my years in graduate school, one of the things that my colleagues, the people that I went to graduate school with, used to emphasize all the time was how accurate the musical 1776 was in terms of the characterization and the personalities of the people involved. John Adams, as played in that series, is so much like John Adams as is revealed in his private papers. The Jefferson in the movie is so like the Jefferson who drafted the Declaration of Independence. If you've seen that film, the musical, 1776, at the very beginning, it opens with John Adams in the bell tower, in the clock tower. And there is a character whose job is to ring the bell on the hour. In other words, to help Philadelphia keep time. And that character is David Rittenhouse. And the movie 1776 opens with Rittenhouse climbing the stairs to the clock tower and asking, "Mr. Adams, are you up here? Mr. Adams, are you up here? They're looking for you. They're ready for a vote." And then John Adams appears for the first time and talks about how foolish they're wasting their time on meaningless votes. They won't get to they're dodging the real question, which is independence. And that's the way the movie 1776 begins. But the character of David Rittenhouse is so significant to Jefferson and so significant to the founders that it is absolutely amazing. And all of us must appreciate this in order to understand Jefferson. Garry Wills makes the point, a brilliant point, that when Jefferson opens the Declaration of Independence by saying, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary to justify," the word necessary. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary. Jefferson believed that the word necessary was the proper word because government, human activity, like the universe, was ordered. Once you understood how things worked, you would know that certain behaviors and certain activities make the activities to follow necessary. What Jefferson is saying in the Declaration of Independence, once you understand all the things that we, the colonists, have been forced to endure at the hands of this king and this parliament, then you will understand why the steps we are about to take are necessary. The use of the word necessary implies system. It suggests order. It basically gives us the clue that independence has become the next logical step in a logical, predictable, understandable series of events where one activity follows the next. And basically, man and man's politics is government and society, like the universe itself, functions around laws, systems, mechanisms, mechanics. In the Enlightenment, the classic image of the Enlightenment to Jefferson and the other founders is the internal operations of a clock. The philosophers, the Enlightenment believers and philosophers, the Diderots and the Humes and the Adam Smiths and the Newtons and the rest of them, they believed that the universe was like a giant clock. And just as the mechanisms within the clock functioned in tune, in tandem, in sync, so also did the universe function that way. They even redefined God, the creator of the universe, and used the image of the clockmaker to help them understand God. God was like a clockmaker for the universe. God created all the planets and the stars. God set everything up. And then, like a clockmaker, he pushed the pendulum and got everything moving. And then God stood back and let the mechanism, which was his universe, his world, function the way it was designed to function. And it was up to man to use his mind to figure out how that operation worked, what made it tick. The religion of the Enlightenment was deism. And Jefferson was a deist. We've run out of time. It is 3 p.m. Our time is up. We will continue this tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. I just absolutely love this stuff. I hope I'm beginning even to convey just a little bit of how exciting I hope this stuff is. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for tuning into the Virtual Center today. We'll be back tomorrow with more on the mind of Thomas Jefferson. Please join us.